Welcome to Symposia Soundbites. I'm Andy Vance with Feedstuffs, here with some speakers at Balchem's pre-conference symposium at the Cornell Dairy Nutrition Conference. One of those speakers was nutritionist Davy Brown with Compass Nutrition. So, Dr. Brown, let's talk about your presentation. If you had to summarize what you told the nutritionist in attendance in 60 seconds or less, what did you talk about?
Well, we looked at the variation that can be associated with milk protein percentage in bulk tank samples and the effects of trying to show value in the responses in the bulk tank from feeding certain dietary inputs like amino acids.
So you're looking at data from cows actually, out there in the field, so to speak, some of the herds that you're consulting on. When you look at that data, what are some of the insights that you've drawn? And how could we apply it to other herds?
Well, there's a lot of variation within herd, there's a lot of variation across herd, and I think since the buyer is looking at loads of milk, and that's the variation that they're living within, we need to do a better job of trying to determine the component content of milk when it leaves the dairy. I think that would be huge, and try to give us a better understanding of, are the things we're feeding showing up in a practical way that changes bulk tank analysis. And that's what the clients value, that's what they get paid on. And so I think that would probably be an area I'd like to focus on. I think the dietary input side is going to have variation, but it's not something routinely done on dairies, is measuring milk components of milk that's leaving the dairy.
If you were walking into a new client for a farm for the first time, what's something that you would expect to see right off the top where, hey, here's an obvious area where we could make an improvement in that regard?
Most of those herds that we walk into, systems approach to looking at several components or aspects of the dairy. And so a lot of guys are only looking at one aspect or another, and they're not really looking at them as codependent things that are occurring. And so we try to kind of look back systematically, get an idea of the seasonal variations, try to separate what's a seasonal response or thing they're looking at versus what's some shorter term actionable item today, whether it's a formulation issue, whether it's technique issues or work instructions or protocols. Those things can get dealt with fairly short term. But the longer cycles, the herds that operate very well, may not really be looking at how those dairies are performing each season of the year and addressing what you do differently in the summer versus winter, becoming a little more tuned into just seasonal alterations and taking actions and rations that way. And then setting up the right expectation as to if we intervene nutritionally at this point of the year versus some other point, what's the expected response curve? Not comparing that point in time to a couple months ago, but that point in time to year over year during the same time period.
You talked about that kind of codependent nature. Nothing happens in a vacuum. In other words, if you play with this variable or pull this lever or switch, it's going to affect something else in the system. Exactly.
And so one of the things that gets confusing on some operations is the idea of pulling a lever or a switch here and then falsely believing that that caused an effect later. Lag effects on dairies are very complicated, hard to track, a lot of difficulty, but I think understanding how you can track that variable from pulling a lever here versus in the future can be tied to seasonal effects oftentimes or other factors that are occurring on the dairy, and it's important to sort those out. It's very important to know, well, would I be in this would this response be where it is anyway if I hadn't done anything different here? Or is this response really additive to my expectations of not doing anything?
So if you were talking to a nutritionist who attended your talk at the symposium, and there was one thing you hope that they took away or wrote down in their notes, what would it be?
If you're trying to show value on today's commercial dairies, I think it's important to engage in how the response indicator, in this case milk protein percent, is being measured. The variation there can cause difficulties in trying to assess whether or not your dietary manipulations are causing a positive response or not. Or in other words, if the variation or if the increase in the response I'm looking for is buried in the background information, you want to know that and really start thinking about how do you overcome that to show value, so you don't wind up in this place that says, okay, we're going to spend money on amino acids, and then later your clients say, what happened? Why did this stop working? Either due to seasonality or just inherent white noise in the system.
Dr. Davy Brown, a nutritionist with Compass Nutrition in Colorado, one of the key speakers at the Balchem Pre-Conference Symposium at the Cornell Dairy Nutrition Conference. If you want to hear Dr. Brown's entire presentation, just follow Balchem's channels and you can watch that presentation in its entirety. For Symposium Soundbites with Feedstuffs, I'm Andy Vance.